In 1908, the French financier and industrialist Albert Kahn launched one of the most ambitious projects in the history of photography. He recruited a team of photographers and sent them around the world to produce what he called a photographic inventory of life on the planet. Driven by the idealistic belief that knowledge of other cultures would promote peace and international understanding, Kahn drew on his immense private fortune to equip his team with the latest photographic technology. They used the autochrome, the world's first user-friendly system capable of taking true color photographs. In the course of the next 2 decades, Kahn's photographers shot over 72,000 autochromes and around 100 hours of film footage. This vast treasury of images records everything from momentous historical events to the intimate details of everyday life. Some of the photographer's finest work was shot in the 1920s, a period when old empires disintegrated. New technologies transformed the way we lived, and Europe struggled to rebuild itself after the chaos and carnage of the First World War. In November 1918, Parisians celebrated the armistice that brought the war with Germany to an end. A correspondent for The Times reported that Paris went charmingly off her head. The whole city resounds with cheers and the Marseillaise. Albert Kahn's cameramen were present on the boulevards, recording the scenes of jubilation.
I think that footage is fascinating because it really captures the outpouring of tremendous emotion, of pent-up feelings at the signature of the armistice. After 4.5 years of hardship, economic hardship, suffering, the loss of loved ones, I think very few of us will ever live through a moment like that.
In the capital, the revelers celebrated on streets lined with the guns and aeroplanes captured from the Germans.
The notion of illustrating the victory in the simplest possible way is to bring home the weapons of war of the other side. Now, of course, these are also symbols of the broken soldiers on the other side, but without the ghoulishness of displaying their bodies.
We see this more static and sober representation of the end of the war, the sort of spoils of war, as it were, versus what can only be described as, a jubilant celebration of a return to life.
Yet as Parisians rejoiced in the streets, grisly scenes were unfolding just a few miles away. The battlefields of the Western Front had been turned into a giant graveyard. Kahn's photographers documented the harrowing discoveries made by those who recovered the bodies of the fallen soldiers.
You can see a shell hole, and lying inside human remains still in uniform. This sort of image wouldn't have been taken by the archive during the war. They steered clear of images which could have had a negative effect on morale. But after the war, such an image is seen as part of the record. It's viewed with the same mindset as the images which documented the ruins and demonstrated the changes that affected society because of the war.
It would have been a daily event for people who returned to the ruins to encounter the dead themselves. And there's real tension between reconstruction and remembrance in this sense, because farmers who are returning to the ruins, they want to restore their earth as soon as possible to productivity. And if they come across bodies, they are legally bound to inform their mayor that there are bodies in their fields and that these bodies need to be identified, and ultimately graves have to be dug for them. Therefore, they're left with a choice. Do they do what is morally and legally right, or do they simply plough these bodies back into the land so that they can start restoring their earth as soon as possible?
The families of the war dead were expected to pay 15 francs for the exhumation of their loved ones. Another 15 francs was levied for transporting their remains, and a further 20 francs was needed for each burial.
Gravediggers were uncovering around 20 bodies a day in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. Most of them, because of the filthy nature of their occupation, would have been very, very highly paid, but they would have found it necessary to get drunk before they even started work because of the stench that came from rotting corpses in the battlefield.
More than 8 million servicemen were killed during the Great War. The conflict would transform Europe forever.
It's a landscape of total devastation. In regions such as the Somme, 30 million cubic metres of earth will be required to fill the trenches, mazes, dugouts and shell holes which remained there after the First World War. There are thousands and thousands of tons of unfired shells in the earth. There are dead bodies. There is barbed wire sufficient across the Western Front, sufficient to wrap around the equator of the earth 7.5 times.
This had been the first war to be fought in the air. In the months after the armistice, Kahn's filmmakers used the reconnaissance airships flown during the conflict to film the devastation of France. Their cameras filmed a 250-kilometre swathe of destruction. Over 750,000 buildings had been reduced to rubble.
The major impact of the First World War was in its legacy of ruined towns, villages, ruined countryside. I think Kahn, coming from where he did, on the borderland, if you like, between the two great combatant nations, France and Germany, would have been particularly aware of the sheer scale of devastation. And I think he would have had a special interest in collecting that footage as an awful warning.
Kahn's remarkable aerial footage is an important historical document, showing in graphic detail the destructive power of the German assault on the towns and cities of France. It was estimated that reconstruction would take at least 10 years and cost billions of francs. France demanded compensation from Germany for the immense damage inflicted on her northeastern territories. Although the armistice was signed in November 1918, it took until the following summer for the terms of the peace treaty to be finalized. On the 28th of June 1919, delegates from around the world gathered at the Palace of Versailles near Paris for the signing of the treaty.
The peace conference was for Albert Kahn, the embodiment of all his political ideals. Here were men of goodwill, whatever their way of thinking, their background or history, all coming together in one place.
Kahn was one of the few granted permission to send a cameraman into the famous Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, where delegates gathered for what would be a pivotal moment in 20th century history.
For Albert Kahn to have been able to send cameramen into the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles to film the signing of the peace treaty and the document itself up close shows that he was extremely well connected. Very few people would have been in a position to do that.
But the terms of the treaty left the German delegation angry and humiliated.
When the treaty had been presented to them initially, they had protested on several grounds and had been told basically they had two choices. One was to sign the treaty and accept German responsibility for having started the war and German responsibility for paying for the reconstruction of Europe, or they could go home and hostilities would recommence with the Allied armies on the borders of Germany ready to march to Berlin.
The treaty required Germany to return the disputed territories of Alsace and Lorraine to France, whittle down its army to just 100,000 troops, and pay huge reparations in cash or industrial goods. The measures were intended to ensure that Germany would be incapable of waging war for years to come. And in creating the League of Nations, the Peace Conference developed an international institution designed to make all war a thing of the past.
It was an attempt to circumscribe the sovereignty of individual states and their capacity to go to war by placing them within a society which would act as a buffer when war crises emerged.
Kahn was an enthusiastic supporter of this idea. During the war, he'd written,
"By embracing a new way of thinking, we can put an end to war and usher in peace. To reproduce old mistakes will keep us in a state of chaos, darkness, anarchy, and destruction."
The League of Nations was a visionary project, by and large the brainchild of the American President Woodrow Wilson, and it provided the basis of the current United Nations today.
As an admirer of Wilson, Kahn ensured that his cameras were there to film the American president's arrival in Paris.
Albert Kahn was a liberal pacifist who viewed war, in some sense, as deeply disturbing, as an outrage. And that, I think, is why Albert Kahn was such a committed supporter of the League of Nations and why he devoted his filmmaking and photographing projects towards trying to ensure that that new peace was built.
The League's headquarters were established in Switzerland. Kahn's Archives of the Planet contain rare film and photographs of key deliberations during the League's early sessions.
Although later in the interwar period an elaborate palace was built, in the crucial period of the 1920s, it sat in a large church hall. And that church hall, which Albert Kahn's photographers documented, was a rather simple, primitive even, setting for these momentous decisions and debates which occurred.
At Versailles, Germany had been compelled to accept the authority of the League, even though their membership had been disallowed. To add further injury to this humiliation, Germany had lost 12% of her territories. One of her concessions was the province of Alsace, which Germany had seized from France in 1871. For Albert Kahn, these images had a special resonance. He had been born in Alsace, and as a boy, he'd witnessed Germany's annexation of the territory in 1871. Now, nearly half a century later, Kahn's photographers would record the return of his homeland to his beloved France.
I'm particularly struck by this photo. This is the future of Alsace, the new generation, small children who, of course, were going to be French. The irony, of course, is that as young Alsatians, they would have only spoken German. Their parents spoke German at home, or Alsatian German. They were taught German at school. And yet, on the 26th of November, their German-speaking teacher would have been dismissed, would have been sacked, and the next day, a French speaker from the interior of France would have come into the classroom and addressed the bewildered children in French.
Kahn was anxious to document the impact of the war on France. He was equally determined to record the effect on his country's most important wartime ally. In Britain, in the summer of 1919, the flags of the Allied powers were displayed all over central London, in readiness for official ceremonies to celebrate victory and to remember the dead. This early morning shot of Oxford Street shows the victory statues that had been commissioned by the retailer Gordon Selfridge and mounted outside his famous department store.
A lot of the pictures taken either a few days before or a few days after the victory parade, the city is incredibly deserted. There's a simple technical explanation for this. The long exposure times make all moving things disappear. But then there's a really useful emotional quality to that. You know, what had happened was really nothing short of apocalyptic. You just get this real sense of it being a land where there's this pall of death hanging over the city.
On the 19th of July, 1919, 15,000 troops from 14 Allied nations set off for a 2.5-hour-long parade through the streets of London.
This, for me, is one of the most remarkable pictures from the archive. More than that, it's one of the most remarkable pictures of that period I think I've ever seen. There's this great army of soldiers walking through London, and although they're there to receive the tribute of the crowd, they're also there to offer tribute to the dead. And I think one of the things that makes it so remarkable is because of the long exposure time, what is a marching column of men just becomes this weird river flowing through the banks of spectators. So what happens is that the picture becomes a picture of the missing, of those who didn't make it back.
On Whitehall, the parade filed past a new monument to the dead. Originally, the cenotaph wasn't intended to be a permanent structure, but it would become one of the most potent and symbolic of all British landmarks.
The government, acutely aware of the cost of the war, had asked the Great Society architect Sir Edwin Lutyens to design a temporary monument which would place the dead at the heart of the victory commemoration. And of course the cenotaph is an empty tomb. So the dead were there right at the heart of the commemoration from the start.
It was calculated that if all of the Empire's million dead marched four abreast down Whitehall, it would take them 3.5 days to clear the cenotaph.
The monument that was used during the commemorations and captured by Kahn's photographers was actually a plasterboard model, not the Portland stone edifice that stands there today.
The photograph is very interesting because it shows us these banks of flowers around it, so that by popular acclamation, the government realized that it had to turn this temporary monument into the permanent cenotaph that we still have today.
I see it as the most powerfully sacred monument in the 20th century in Britain. The word is to the glorious dead. It was essentially a statement saying that we glorify those who die in war, and we do not glorify war itself.
Like Britain, France had resolved to mark the sacrifice of its servicemen. In the years after the war, no fewer than 38,000 war memorials were built in towns and villages across the country. No war had cost so many lives. No war would give rise to so many sites of remembrance. The most ambitious of all the memorials was constructed at Verdun, the scene of one of the bloodiest confrontations of the war. During 300 days of fighting, an astonishing 26 million shells rained down on the German and French troops who fought here.
At Douaumont, on the Verdun battlefield, site of some of the fiercest fighting, one of the most important French war memorials was set up after the war. It is built in the form of a Breton church tower with a light at the top of it. It commemorates inside those who fought at Verdun, the missing of Verdun, those whose bodies were never found.
Inside, the names and rank of those who made the ultimate sacrifice are carved in stone. While in the basement lie the skeletal remains of over 130,000 unidentified soldiers. In 1920, the Kahn archive documented the creation of Douaumont's ossuary. Initially, the remains of those who died at Verdun were stored in this simple wooden barrack.
This sacralization of the great battlefield of France is something that had to be in the archive, because the most important legacy of the war was its monstrous capacity to kill. Anyone who had a pacifist vision, as Kahn did, would go to Douaumont, because to go there is to realize that war is impossible, unthinkable.
By 1927, a more elaborate building had been constructed, which by night lends a haunting power to the memorial. A searchlight from the ossuary's tower sweeps across the 15,000 graves that surround it. Touring northern France became a macabre pilgrimage as thousands of people came to see the legacy of war.
A sort of war tourism developed. Albert Kahn came to these places to witness the scale of the devastation.
Local people often resented this morbid curiosity.
There were two types of day trippers as far as they were concerned. The genuine pilgrims who would go to the sites of memory across the Western Front, or those who were coming to search out the grave of a lost loved one. But there was also a very voyeuristic element. Returnees to the ruins who had had such a hard time in the interior were apt to see the people who were coming in trainloads across the ruins as real voyeurs who were coming simply to view the freak show, to look at people who they'd heard described as savages and troglodytes amongst all the filth and muck of the Western Front.
In the years after the war, France desperately needed to restore its agricultural land to full productivity and rebuild the towns and villages that the conflict had destroyed. But with a third of the country's manpower dead or permanently wounded, France needed to attract labour from abroad.
In order to reconstruct France, a lot of immigrant workers arrived. Remember, a lot of men had been killed in the war, and there was a real shortage of essential manpower. The Italians and a few Portuguese came to do the building work. It was the Poles and a few Russians who came for the farming. We had a huge influx of foreign workers. A lot of them stayed and ended up marrying French women. After all, there weren't many men left.
Over 500,000 workers from across Europe arrived in France to help rebuild the country. But they couldn't always rely on a warm welcome from their hosts.
The French were very suspicious of the foreigners who came to work on the reconstruction. They're very much hated and seen as a racial threat to the true Frenchmen, whose numbers are clearly depleted by the bloodshed during the First World War.
While growing up in northeast France, Raymond Roncaroni was victimized because his father was a migrant worker from Italy.
In my village, the majority of inhabitants were either Polish or Italian. The French would insult us by calling us macaroni or accuse us of stealing France's daily bread. But all that didn't last long, because we were feisty. And there were more of us Polish and Italian kids at school than there were French.
The newcomers arrived in a country in the grip of a housing crisis. In France, 2 million people had been left homeless by the war. Many were forced to live in hastily built wooden shacks.
They were incredibly leaky, or some of them were indeed rotten. What they were provided with by way of repairs was just roll upon roll of tarred cardboard, which would last, I guess, a matter of weeks before it too began to leak. Newspapers in the ruins would refer to these as aquarium huts during the sort of rainy times and said, you are best off going to bed with an umbrella because you are sure to get wet by the morning.
But good weather could cause problems too. Cécile Derlon grew up in Soissons, which had been shelled relentlessly by the Germans. After the war, she was educated in a hut, where even sunny conditions were hazardous.
It was so hot in 1921 that we had to go to school in our petticoats. The roofs of the wooden barracks had to be hosed down to stop them from catching fire. For about a year, I went to a school like that, made of wood.
Obliterated French homes were a constant reminder of the conflict, and the Allies remained mistrustful of their former adversary. In December 1918, Allied troops had marched into Germany to take control of an area of strategic importance, the Rhineland.
By the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the Allies occupied the Rhineland of Germany for a period of 15 years, and the Rhineland was made permanently a demilitarized zone. This was to prevent it being a springboard for unexpected invasions of France.
If Germany refused to fulfill its commitments, these troops in the Rhineland would be in a good position to move into Germany proper and march through to Berlin to reimpose the peace settlement on Germany by force.
The French tricolor now flew over German territory. Across the Rhineland, French translations were added to every sign. The war had left Germany in political and economic turmoil, and the financial penalties exacted by the Allies added to the country's woes. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was required to pay reparations to compensate for the damage suffered by the Allies during the war. The sum demanded was colossal, more than £6.5 billion.
An Allied commission was set up to determine the amount that the Germans should pay, but in 1922 the Germans stopped paying. And it seemed as if the British and the Americans were prepared to accept this. The French, and with them the Belgians, weren't. And they therefore moved beyond the Rhineland into the Ruhr in order to physically take the reparations and maintain their payment.
On January 11, 1923, French tanks rolled into Germany's industrial heartland. The coal mines and factories of the Ruhr had been the driving force of the German economy. Its workers decided to resist the French occupation.
The response to the invasion of the Ruhr surprised everybody. They'd invaded other chunks of territory in 1920 and so on, and had always been met with a passive, if unfriendly, reception. This time, however, the workers in the Ruhr, the trade union organised workers, refused to cooperate in any way. The railwaymen sabotaged the railways. The coal miners refused to mine coal for the reparation authorities. The steel men threatened to damp down their furnaces. In fact, economic life in the Ruhr quickly came to a stop.
Germany's economic crisis deepened as industrial production ground to a halt. The government printed money to meet its shortfall in revenues. Inflation spiraled out of control, and within a year, the price of a loaf of bread rose from just a few pfennigs to an astonishing 340 million marks. The economic meltdown left millions of Germans starving. With the country in turmoil, political activists in the Rhineland agitated against their own government and campaigned for independence.
This poster was issued at the start of the so-called separatist uprising in the Rhineland in October 1923. The German mark had completely collapsed. You needed trillions of the things to buy a potato, and there were isolated voices in the west of Germany who just said things have got to the point now where we would be better independent, better to be a pro-French, independent Rhineland than to have any further part in Germany. And these people, in late October, with French encouragement, staged an uprising.
Kahn's photographers encountered the separatist leaders who signalled their allegiance by wearing armbands in red, white and green, the colours of the flag they hoped would one day fly over an independent Rhineland.
Clearly they're trying to act the statesman here for Monsieur Kahn's cameras. These, they hoped, would be the record of their first days in office.
But the political unrest generated great anxiety. Across the Rhineland, shopkeepers boarded up their windows, fearing that trouble was imminent.
Clearly no one wanted to be out in the streets. They had no idea who might or might not shoot them or what would happen to them. There was this belief that these separatists were, as trade union officials put it, people of the worst sort.
In the northern town of Krefeld, the separatists turned to violence. In October 1923, they stormed the town hall, and their gunfire left a policeman wounded. His fellow officers tried to rescue him, but he was pulled inside the building and murdered at point-blank range. This remarkable picture shows the crime scene, complete with the murder weapon. Soon, news of the unrest in the Rhineland reached governments around the world.
The protests from London were almost unprintable. The reaction from the United States was one of incandescent fury. And so within 7 or 8 days, the French and Belgian authorities had issued instructions to their troops to arrest the leading separatists and to put a stop to the whole thing. And that was the end of the whole sorry affair.
Within days, support for the revolution fizzled out, and the separatists' dream of an independent homeland vanished. Kahn's German photographs capture a nation that was desperate, violent, and chaotic. But remarkably, by the end of 1923, the economy stabilized, thanks in large part to the actions of Germany's new Chancellor, Gustav Stresemann. And in 1925, as foreign minister, Stresemann was part of a delegation that restored Germany's reputation amongst her former enemies. In the Swiss town of Locarno, Europe's statesmen gathered to discuss how they could resolve future international tensions.
The Locarno treaties, signed in 1925, were the real beginning of peacemaking in Europe after the Great War. They were first of all, and most importantly, the introduction of the idea of arbitration in international disputes. This meant, and it was very important, that the war was over, that people would not resort to arms in the future, but that they would try and negotiate their difficulties.
Kahn may have secured access to the meetings through the offices of one of his many high-powered acquaintances, the French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand.
That's a photograph of the French delegation. The central figure is Aristide Briand, and he was a superb politician. He got the conference off to a very good start because the German Chancellor Luther was making a rather long and ponderous speech about German sufferings. And Briand chipped in and said, "Oh, don't go on, you'll make us all cry." And then when Luther looked rather cross and put out, Briand made a kind of comical, terrified expression, and made Stresemann, the German foreign minister, burst out laughing. And that was absolutely characteristic of Briand. He had a sort of magician's way of changing the atmosphere of a meeting.
Later, Kahn invited one of those who'd brokered the deal at Locarno, the British Foreign Minister, Austen Chamberlain, to visit his home in Paris. For their part in the negotiations, Chamberlain, Stresemann and Briand were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
And I suppose the essential point is that in Paris in 1919, Germany had had no alternative but to accept the peace treaty. It couldn't fight on. But the point about Locarno and then entering the League of Nations is here is Germany willingly, voluntarily accepting international obligations and becoming a full member of the League, and also therefore being acknowledged as a great power again and a civilized power.
Across the continent, Europeans could at last enjoy the dividends of peace. Kahn cinematographers recorded the gradual lightening of the mood by filming here at the chic French holiday resort of Deauville, near Le Havre.
Deauville represented Paris by the sea. Just as Brighton was London by the sea, Deauville had horse racing, polo, and the casino, and this lovely beach. It was an area where people went to be on holiday. It was only 230 kilometers from Paris, an easy drive by the new automobile. And that is the way that Deauville is seen, as a day out, as a long weekend, or as a holiday place during the summer.
In Paris, the capital's legendary nightlife was revived. After the restraint of the war years, the City of Light glittered once more as Parisians flocked to the city's dance halls.
Well, because dancing was a spontaneous expression of freedom, you expressed that kind of fascination with being alive, fascination with rediscovering people of the opposite sex, of getting close to people of the opposite sex, openly for the first time. It had been frowned on during the war. It had happened, but it hadn't been covert. Now it was overt.
Magic City was a very popular dance hall. And the footage is interesting because if you notice, there are a lot of women dancing with other women. And this reminds us of an important social fact. As a result of the First World War, there just weren't a lot of men of dateable or marriageable age around.
As well as recording Europe at play, Kahn's cinematographers spent the post-war years observing technological innovations that would change the world.
This is the golden age of aviation. The French were at the forefront of so much of aviation technology during this period. So, you know, there is this sense of them recording the glories of technology.
During the war, France had produced an enormous number of aeroplanes. And aviation manufacturing was at a height in 1918. And so there was this great shift of aviation from the military sector into the private sector. And the fascination with flight remains one of the highest, if you like, legacies of the modernity of the First World War.
Kahn's dream was to capture the entire planet on film and in photographs. Aerial camera work gave him the chance to produce an image of the world from the heavens. And another technical innovation gave him the chance to glimpse a world beyond the scope of the naked eye. Microscopes fitted with cameras could reveal the inner workings of the tiniest organisms. Fascinated by the possibilities of this microcinematography, Kahn approached the leading scientific filmmaker of the day, Dr. Jean Commandant.
Jean Commandant was a pioneer in the field of microcinematography. Films that allow us to see the infinitely small, to see inside our bodies, to see the evolution of cells within human blood, for example, are taking us into, the previously unseen in a way that, we could have never imagined.
Scientific films, or popular science films as they were called in some places, were one of the surprise hits of early moving pictures. You find audiences being fascinated by, close-ups of cheese mites and microbes.
Kahn became Commandant's patron, and at his Paris mansion built a state-of-the-art laboratory where Commandant could produce his films.
He also funded the construction of a new ultra-microscopic camera, which enabled him to do further research. And he worked there and produced, a good number of films between around 1923 and 1929. It seems that the Commandant films, in particular the films of time-lapse sequences of flowers blooming, were some of the most popularly and regularly projected of the Kahn films.
Though Kahn was intrigued by progress in science and technology, he was just as fascinated by ancient traditions and ways of life.
War turned everything on its head, and that was what Kahn recorded. But when the war ended, Kahn's project returned to its idea of promoting peace and documenting the countryside and daily life.
In France throughout the 1920s, age-old working practices such as collecting mussels or harvesting grapes were lovingly preserved in Kahn's Archives of the Planet. After the terrible trauma of war, his photographers witnessed the return of the traditional harmonies of rural life.
Getting back to the land was a dream most French soldiers had when they were in the trenches. And when they returned to the land and started to build up again the lives that had been interrupted by military service, we can see a pride, we can see indeed a skill, and a partnership, very frequently with women workers, which hadn't been there before the war.
These amazing colour photographs show the obsession in the 1920s with the return to the land. Very much a theme of France in the 20s, as it had been during the First World War. The eternal peasant, the values of La France profonde, something which was there at the very backbone of the French military endeavour and of the victory of 1918.
Kahn's archive had borne witness to the lives of thousands of people who'd survived the carnage of the First World War. His images capture the emotional and political consequences of the conflict and Europe's recovery from the greatest war the world had ever known.
The 20s are exceptional for Albert Kahn. For him, it's the decade of hope. The world is in the throes of trying to find a lasting peace. Prosperity is gradually returning. And the archive captures the great diversity and wealth of this period.
By the end of the decade, Albert Kahn's archives of the planet had amassed hundreds of rolls of film footage and over 72,000 color photographs. His project had documented some of the pivotal moments of the 20th century and recorded Europe's transition from war to peace.
The photographs in the Kahn collection, they are extremely rare, and in particular to find them in such number and covering such a variety of topics, that is unique, to have a collection of that richness.